such a pleasure to be sharing a dais with you from the time 25 years ago and before that and now. A brief introduction to for those of you who don't know Geeta, Vimla and Mr. Nanda, although I don't know how that is possible for people sitting in this room, but nevertheless, Mr. Nanda is an administrator par excellence and a demographer par excellence. He has led India's health ministry. He has led India's count of the population. He's been Registrar General of India, and he had a very, very key role to play in the formulation of India's national population policy. He's been honored in many ways for his work in administration, as well as his work on censuses and demography. And he's been on the chair and is a member of the board of many international and national organizations and foundations. And he's been a mentor for many people who have worked on population over the last 2 decades. 3 decades, I must say. Geeta is an economist, although much of her work is on what underlies economics, the lives of people. She's a public health specialist. She's worked on gender and population. And she has this remarkable skill of taking what an individual sees as their world, linking it up with national policy processes and with global policy processes. And that's what Geeta has done for the last so many years. She's worked with IIM. She is currently the Distinguished Professor and Director of the Ramalinga Swamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health of PHFI. She's an adjunct professor at Harvard School of Public Health. She is the general coordinator of DAWN, which is a network of women globally working on these issues. She's advised NHSRC, the National Health Systems Resource Center, and the National Rural Health Mission groups, global groups on universal health care. She's written many books on population, on gender, and on rights. She's won the Volvo Prize for her work on women. Vimla is an educationist, and she's educated a lot of us on a lot of things. She's written extensively on access to education, on quality of education, on the right to education, and particularly on girls' access to education. Vimla had designed and led the Mahila Samakya program and brought it to the level of its really incredible performance and transformative role that program played in India's educational development. Vimla has written many books on education. The list runs into about 4 pages back to back with small print. So I'm not going to go into that. But Vimla also played a very, very active role here in India in leading up to Cairo. At the time that the Cairo conference happened, there was a lot of discord between government, civil society, and donors around issues of population. And Vimla orchestrated a process along with many people who are here in this room to make a dialogue possible and to bridge the gaps in perspective, to find common ground and to go forward. And the benefits of that we have seen not only at Cairo, because there was so much collaborative action in Cairo between the government delegation and the Indian civil society delegation, but also after Cairo, in actually putting in place many things that action the vision of Cairo. So we're very fortunate to have Vimla, Mr. Nanda, and Geeta here with us to speak about that time and this time. So I'm going to shoot off a few questions to each of you, and I'd like to start with Mr. Nanda. Mr. Nanda, you've done a lot of work. You've dedicated your career to fight for women's rights, for girls' health and women's health. And we'd like to know what inspired you to do this. It's not a standard career choice.
Well, it's very difficult to say what really inspired, but maybe I remember 2 things. One is my mother and my wife. Both of them are no more. And both of them were the driving I mean, inspiration and the driving force, I should say, and particularly my wife, uh, who believed in rights and choices. And from day one of our marriage, I knew I am glued to those things. Otherwise, the marriage will not work. So I accepted that initially. The the what you call the instincts, which I don't know, maybe as male instinct or whatever, or maybe tradition and all that, was sort of staring at me that no, you shouldn't accept it. But I found it is good to accept not only for better conjugal life, but also it's good. Later on, I found as I went into my studies of demography, population study, and also in career in the administrative service, that it did pay. And I was glued, I was very much sort of attached to the women's rights. And I did that to my three daughters. I never went for a son, not, it's again a choice by both of us. And I'm very proud to say of my daughters, three daughters, I stay with my daughters. But now that I'm alone, I don't have a separate house. So I move from one place to the other and stay with them, their family. Is that both very personal?
No, it's perfect.
So,
Tell us more.
yeah, and that's what really, I mean, I shouldn't say that it is something that I still get, sort of, for example, my daughter, who is now Miranda House principal, gives me every day, reminds me that you are still talking in the old language of patriarchy. Still something left. So unfinished agenda of ICPD. So that's the unfinished agenda. The mindset, and that's the unfinished agenda. The mindset of many of us who were part of bureaucracy and are part of bureaucracy, our guests here and some of them, have been today, have been something like that we control, we know everything, that we are, it's something of an authoritarian type of mentality. And that's what is challenge, a big challenge, even in delivery of SRHR in India. That's my experience, having worked in government and after government, also in civil society, that it's a serious challenge, which is yet, it has changed, but very slowly, very slowly. I won't name any ministry, but even in the same ministry that I handle, health ministry, still it was population control. Even now, grudgingly they call it population stabilization. They will not go down below that as a people-centered program. They were having targets. In our time, we abolished target just by one order. No contraceptive specific targets. Now we are trained by very eminent demographers and population control wallahs and many in the political and bureaucratic scenario. They're saying that why this has replanted like this, family planning, is because of ICPD, because of your abolishing the targets. But that's not the truth. The targets have come back with a vengeance in the name of ELA, expected level of achievement. And everybody understands that. Their incentives rise, disincentives. So these are the types of things that really is the biggest challenge.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Nanda, because it also shows us that when we speak about rights and we speak about quality and we speak about governance, these are not concepts. They only become real when this is the way we are, the way an individual is and the way a leader is. That's when everything is transformed. beautiful words on pieces of paper don't change anything, but people who live those words change things. Rita, for you, can you please share with us a memory or a takeaway from those days in Cairo so that those of us who are still working on it and are going to be working on it in the future can be inspired?
Yeah, I can think of many, many memories come. And there are a number of people in the room for whom Cairo probably evokes not the same memories maybe, but very powerful memories, because it was a very powerful time and a powerful transformative moment in our lives, and I think in the history of the long march towards gender equality and the realization of women's human rights. I think for me, one of the memories that's, I remember there were these two delegates walking down one of the corridors in between sessions. And I won't say which country they were from, it doesn't matter. I knew who they were. Men in suits. And one of them was just saying to the other, "There's too much sex in this conference." And I remember that it struck me, goodness me, how on earth have you people been holding population conference after population conference after population conference without ever talking about sex? Human beings are not amoebas. We reproduce by and large through sex. So if you're so concerned about population growth, well, there's a little bit that happens without it these days. But certainly in '94, it was almost entirely only one way of doing it. And you have been able to take out of your discussions of population growth, the need to control the growth, the need to do this and that, without addressing what is one of the absolute basis of all of your population growth, all of this fertility that you want to control, all of these things that you want to do. And I remember that moment it really occurred to me how large the gap was between where we who were the insurgents of that conference and the establishment of the conference was in terms of the mindsets that Mr. Nanda spoke about. And I'm not sure, and I share your worries about this, whether we've in fact been able to bring about the extent of the change in mindsets that's really needed for that. And in the context of India, I would just say one thing and then leave it at that, is that a few days ago in Delhi, I was talking about, and in another venue, about the toxic impacts of inequality on health. We are, in that sense, a very toxic society. We're a lovely society in many ways, but that inequality sort of lives in our bones, our DNA, our core, over millennia, is something that shapes how we behave with each other, how we treat those who we think are not our equals, and the authoritarian mindset is not just the purview of a few here and there. It sort of seeps through us. And I think that that is so fundamentally antithetical to what we were trying to do at Cairo. And I think that was really the basis of a gap. If you ask me, I agree with you that that's the gap that still needs to be filled.
To say that we smuggled you into the official delegation by sharing my card. You came, and I stayed outside.
But as Gita, you so rightly say, that sense of that savoring of the inequality that exists in society, not just that it exists, but we tolerate it and we want it to remain, not only impacts relationships on a regular level, but it also impacts the way systems deal with science. And the whole issue of rights and quality is, that's the fulcrum of it. How do people view each other? Whether it's a doctor and a patient, or it's a senior doctor and a junior paramedic, or whatever it is, this sense of inequality becomes disrespect. It becomes lack of quality, and it becomes a violation of rights. So that really is at the core of everything. Vimla, for you, please, since we're sharing across generations here, and we have in the room many young people who work on this agenda and who will continue to work on this agenda. Some insights from you, a message from you, something personal or something professional?
What pushed me in the direction in which I finally went was that running and working with rural women from the education space, I realized that women are able to negotiate whatever reproductive choices they make or family choices they make only when they are more confident, when they have access to information, they're more connected with other women as a collective, they have access to knowledge, they have access to information if they want it, they have recourse to institutions or groups that would respond empathetically towards whatever they need. And in this backdrop, when I was just leaving the government in 1993, Ina came up and said, why don't you come and work with us in UNFPA? I mean, I just barely left the government, and within a month, Ina comes and gives this, and she says, we are actually trying to work towards building some kind of cross connections and some kind of collaboration towards ICPD. So will you come and join us as a consultant to steer this process? And this is what I felt very strongly, that in India, wherever I went, this family planning targets was a major issue. We're talking about the 80s and 90s, early 90s. And it was not just an issue with the health sector, but people in the education sector were given targets. People in rural development were given targets. But women themselves, when you talk to them, that they were able to negotiate this only when they had these other connections. So somewhere for me, what we were working towards were ICPD, looking at the needs and aspirations of women in a much broader sense than just very narrow reproductive or availability or non-availability of contraceptives. It was a very important issue. There was also another thing which drove me really, is that this contradiction which was there in India. At one level, women wanted contraception. Women wanted to limit their families. At another level, they were very unhappy with the coercive environment. So how do you negotiate this? They want it, but the environment in which they can seek it wasn't there. And in the same platform, here were us in the women's movement. I was very much part of the women's movement on the streets those days. We were actually agitating against all kinds of contraceptives. Remember, whether it is injectables, whether it is even any kind of family planning. So there were these three very disconnected trends which was bothering me a lot, because it is a requirement that women felt, but the environment just wasn't there to be able to facilitate a process whereby they could negotiate it from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness. I'll stop here now.
Because what you're saying in terms of what individual women want, that needs to be echoed, and there needs to be a safe space around those women, whether it's through networks or through support systems or whatever. We need to have those safe spaces around women so that what's within can also be without. Mr. Amba, can you please tell us what you think in terms of other emerging issues now that we neglected to address in Cairo and neglected to put on the agenda? Is there some rethinking we need to do? Do we need to do things differently? Those gaps.
Yes. You see, while I was part of the formulation of the National Population Policy, which came in 2000, it was being formulated, I mean, it was part of the discussions which was going on for years. There was another policy earlier, which came in during the national emergency, but it was a policy statement, which, I mean, if you see that, it is hardly a population policy. It is, you know, what happened in emergency is well known after that. But this, for the first time, and it was a real sort of, I mean, I should say, every day we were having meetings with ministers, very powerful ministers. Then it was, you know, two governments. The third government was the Vajpayee government. And it was so difficult to convince them that a population policy is a population and development policy. They would not like to see anywhere the name sex. So what sexual rights? So we cut out sex and then put life skills, this, that, like that. You know, this is all UNFPA advised us, life skills, don't write. So, okay. Then rights, reproductive rights. My God, they said, what is reproductive rights? No. Just take it out. Reproductive health, okay, fine, you have explained it, but where is family planning? You have to write family planning in the beginning, in the middle, in the end. Because you see, our entire education system, as you know, is economics or anything you study in the school or thereafter. That way, we have been taught about population. Population as a liability, population cause of poverty. So if you put it in a different way, the quality of life, then population, even containing population growth, would require these rights and choices. So it was a very tough decision, but anyway, we did to some extent, I should say. But what happened after that, national population policy, is it is yet to take deep roots in the minds of people who would implement. So that is one. Secondly, your question, you know exactly what you say. The one is the unfinished agenda. The other is, as you say, the sexual rights and sexual health only limited way because of HIV/AIDS scourge. You know, they try to show, okay, sexual health means this. But that has not been really taken up seriously, not only in India, but many other countries. And as you know, there were reservations by Holy See and many other things, even in ICPD. It was not a full consensus, so they had to write in a different way. And I remember there was a fight between me and another country's delegation, a lady, who started saying that you, India, always try to dominate over us and try to put these words, secular, this, that. So we have to take it away, secular and many other words in one of the drafting. So what I'm saying is this is one area, and particularly we have to now take into account these sexual rights, sexual choices, and those issues are very important because if we don't do it now, luckily it is being done. It's being recognized by the highest judiciary of the land. It's a very good trend. The government also is doing that. You know, what you call third gender, transgender, or any of the ideas of that is something which we have to recognize. That is something which is not there. Even in ICPD, I hardly see anywhere. That's a reference, but not to that extent. The Holy See and many other countries would not like us to go anywhere nearer. The other aspect is the, although it is being mentioned there everywhere that, health for all, right from Almata, now universal health coverage. You see, India has done quite a bit on that, I should say. I mean, India means government. You have National Rural Health Mission, you have Health Mission, you have now Ayushman Bharat, a national health policy which speaks the right language. But as you very rightly say, the language just remains there. When it comes to this thing, all the rights and choices are given back. The other aspect that I would say, which is not very clearly, is of course, again, I will come back to that, is the interrelationship between population and sustainable development. It is very much there, but in terms of the planning, health planning, for example, health planning is done in one way. Then you have development planning in another way. So I think that needed to be at the highest level, a very close way it has to be put. The population has to be put 50-50. So these are the two things I think I would say.
In fact, three things, Mr. Nalla, about sexual rights, reproductive rights, about universal health care, much more needed to be done. And thirdly, that when we do planning, it's more integrated. We're looking at population and development, health, and the whole spectrum of sustainable development in a more integrated way. That's a very big
I will just say one thing. In that, you see, many of the plans that if you see, of course, now there is no planning commission, but Niti Aayog is there. But many of the plans that are there, you will find reference to population, but only as the cause of whatever has happened, but not the other way. That is one. And secondly, the emphasis that has to be given on what you call education. Education, and particularly the type of education, type of information that is missing in money. And that's why you require community level. One of the way that you can, community level planning and community level monitoring.
Vimla, so looking back from now to then, what do you think are the pain points, particular pain points, and what have been the significant breakthroughs since then?
It would not be fair to say that nothing has happened. A lot has happened. A lot has happened in the larger society. In fact, the last 25 years has seen some very positive changes in trends. What was responsible for bringing that out? I cannot really put my finger on it, but there are few changes which I see quite evident. From 1994 to now, one thing which I think your colleague also presented is that, let me just preface it. In the last 8 years, 5 or 6 years really, I've done very deep work in secondary education. So that is what I've been working on. So a lot of my insights are coming from that because I've interacted very closely with adolescent boys and girls, both in school and out of school. So my insights are really coming from there. The one change that I find quite significant across the country, even in the most, is that very, very early child marriage has really come to an end. You find very few cases of girls before the age of 14 who are getting married. But early marriage between, say, 15 and 18 has not gone up, but it's not come down to the same extent. But what is for me is very interesting when we talk to girls and mothers is an awareness about not having children till their body is actually ready for it. And I found this quite surprising when you talk about it, because when you talk to parents, because we also do focus group discussion with mothers and fathers. So this awareness about what is really the right time, it's not just a legal issue that it's against the law to marry your child early. For instance, there was one area where I recently did some field work just about a month and a half ago. This was in Chittorgarh district. And many, many parents told me this very clearly, that कानून का सवाल नहीं है, हमारी बेटी तैयार नहीं है. I think that is a very important message and change that has come about. Now, whether it has come about in all communities, in all over the country, I will not be able to say. But definitely winds of change are definitely blowing. The second, as a result of the change in mindset, I do not know whether it's a chicken and egg question, girls' participation, completion of elementary education has gone up significantly. And today, close to 51% of girls in that particular age group are actually enrolled in secondary school. I would offer one correction to the presentation that was made today, is that it's not, when you talk about attendance rates, the DICE attendance rate is about how many children who are already enrolled are attending. But when you look at NSSO, you get 8 specific attendance rates, which basically means that in a particular age group, how many children, how many girls, and how many boys are reporting that they have attended secondary school. Now, I find that has gone up to about 50+%. I'm talking about the most recent one. But what is more interesting is that the gender gap has closed significantly. And it is closing at a much faster rate. And why is it closing? One is a positive trend and one is a negative trend. The positive trend is many more girls are actually going into secondary school. And the negative trend is many more boys are dropping out. The dropout rates of boys in places like Assam, West Bengal, Gujarat, in some of these places, is higher than that of girls. Having entered high school, the number of boys who drop out is actually increasing, while the number of girls who are dropping out is actually going down. So I think there are these certain trends which I see visible. I cannot attribute it only to ICPD or not, but I have to attribute it to the overall change in the environment in terms of our policies, in terms of where we're going. So I think secondary education has acted as a very important trigger to not only delay child marriage, but also in terms of awareness about not having children before your body is physically ready. If you just give me one more minute, I'd like to say a few things which have really worried me. One thing which is really worrying me is in the name of life skills. I really like the word life skills. I have no problem. In fact, when you look at all the work that's being done with adolescent girls, it's only to do with their sexuality. You're somewhere ignoring the other needs of these young women. Their educational needs, their training needs, their work needs, employment needs. What are we trying to prepare these young people for? Equally disturbing is that we are not working with boys. And you know, in this recent study, which was commissioned by the World Bank on secondary education, we found talked to boys across. in these states that we worked in, the boys said, "Ladkiyon ko sab kuch milta hai." The girls are getting incentives. The girls are getting cycles. There is an adolescent girls forum. Girls are getting supplementary nutrition. Girls are getting this. Can we bring about social change if we don't involve and integrate boys in this process? And I think for me, that's a very disturbing thing that I'm seeing, that there is a divergence. And that too, when you're talking to girls, you're talking about the reproductive health only, to the exclusion of issues of work, exclusion of the issues. Final point, our system has also become very insensitive. The secondary education system in India is, at least in North and Northwestern India, Gujarat, Rajasthan, girls' secondary schools don't offer science, maths, biology. Why? In Banswara, the girl said, "I want to become a A&M nurse, but I can't do that because I don't have biology in my 11th and 12th." And why can't you go to the co-ed school to study biology? Sexual harassment. It's very bad in Rajasthan. Even if the girls want to study science and go to a co-educational school, they don't go. And when I'll come back, if I have time, I've got some very interesting insights from this recent study that we did. But I'd like to stop here now. Thanks.
Quite a few blind spots for us to address and correct. Geeta, back to you. So where does this leave us in terms of major expectations from the UN system and from UNFPA in particular?
The first one. Damned if I don't.
Well, you're used to being put in a spot and you always manage to handle it very well. So,
okay, I'm going to take that as license to tell you what you should be doing over the next. Okay, so I'm not going to. I agree with a number of the things that both Mr. Nanda and Bimla said, and I'm therefore not going to touch on those, but pick up on some others. I'm not going to touch on the question of universal health care, about which I have a great deal to say, but I think he's said enough. The fragmentation between population and health continues 25 years after ICPD. It's quite dramatic. I'm not going to say much about adolescence, and I think Bimla is much, much better informed from the ground on the shifting realities. But there's a few other things that I want to address. Migrants. We are actually, at this point, the data says that we are more a country of migrants than not. And that the proportion of workforces that are actually migratory in this country are huge. What that means in terms of services, in terms of rights, in terms of where systems should be going and thinking and so on, is, I think, an extremely weak area. And if UNFPA has to pick up some part of the traditional population issues, of which migration is a traditional issue, I think this is a very big one that needs to be picked up. What does ICPD mean for migrant workers' children are living on increasingly on the edges of urban and peri-urban slums in India? I think this is a huge issue that we need to be thinking about. A second one is this. The question of violence and harassment that Bimla touched on. I do believe that because of the twists and turns of the political arena in this country, the shift towards more conservative views around sexuality have now, and some missteps and so on in earlier times, has made government agencies and everybody really not want to touch this at all. And I think we can't afford to do that. We cannot afford to leave comprehensive sexuality education in limbo anymore, because in fact, this huge spiking of violence, driven by many things, including, it's my personal belief, sort of picked up, which keeps getting backed up by bits of evidence from here and there. The fact that, you know, largely young people and largely young men have access through the internet to the most vicious forms of violence against women. And that we have absolutely nothing to say in terms of dealing with that is, I think, a huge problem. The young men who used to sit on the corners, you know, lounging on a bicycle and desultorily whistling at the, you know, neighborhood girls who walk by, look like saints compared to the young men of today who are sitting fiddling on their cell phones. And every time I go by and I see that, I have chills running up, because I don't know what it is that they're watching or thinking about as they see young women go by. And I think we cannot afford to ignore this problem anymore. We've got to figure out how, and comprehensive sexuality education for both boys and girls is crucial in order to really start making a dent in this. It needs to be brought out as a health issue. It needs to be brought out as a violence issue. It needs to be brought out as a societal safety issue, every way that we can. And I think this is a big agenda, but it's a nettle that we have to grasp. And finally, well, not finally, I have two more. MTP. When are we going to see that amended MTP Act become law? It's been sitting in limbo again for years now. There was a time when we were told it's just coming. Now we're not even told that. And we need that in order to move beyond what became a stasis through the combination of our fears around sex-selective abortion and declining sex ratios, and the desire to support access to abortion. But there are parts of this country, as anybody who works in the field and on the ground, and growing parts of this country where you simply cannot get an abortion in the public system. You just cannot. They will just turn you away. Now, of course, some of that has been picked up by the availability of medical abortion, but that is completely unregulated and all over the place. And whatever we hear about the regulation for that is draconian. We don't need draconian regulation of abortion pills either. And I do believe that that is something we need collectively. This is not just a UNFPA agenda, but collectively we need to push for the government to actually sort of take this forward and stop. You know, there are two bills that they're not even bills, I suppose. Well, one is a bill, that both of which are critical for women in this country that have this status. One, of course, being the infamous Women's Reservation, and the other one is now become MTP, the amended MTP Act. And finally, one bigger picture question on which I think UNFPA, the UN system, and all of us together really need to be paying serious attention. There is this declining work participation issue, which is going to drown us all over the next decade if we don't pay attention to it. We used to think that meaning a year ago, I used to say that what is happening with female work participation in this country, it's a huge decline in a relatively short 5-year span, is the canary in the mine. What is happening to women? It's like the canary that the miners would carry in the old days into the coal mines. And when the bird stopped singing and flopped over and died, the miners knew it was time to get out of the mine. So it's the early warning signal that something is wrong. And I used to think that it was women's work participation that played that role. We now know it's not only women. Male participation rates have fallen hugely. And no amount of government or anybody else pretending that that's not happening or not allowing the data to come out that tell us what is happening is going to change that reality. That means that the girls who are going through secondary school in your studies, Vimla, what's ahead for them? What jobs are we thinking about that these young women will be going into? And I think as a longer term, medium to longer term thing, we really need to be paying attention to this as a critical population development and human rights issue.
Thank you. That's all very sobering and very much on the button. There's some issues here that are totally virulent that need to be tackled in a very sensitive and in fact urgent manner. And your observations about several UN agencies needing to work on them, we're fortunate to have representatives from several agencies here. So I'll come back to them with a request to comment on this or other things. But before we do that, there were several people at Cairo who are in this room. And I'd like to see if you would like to say something about your experiences and the relevance of that for today, or just the relevance of the agenda and what you feel we need to be doing to safeguard that agenda going forward. So Mirai, since I'm looking at you, and can I request people to also just briefly introduce themselves as you speak?
Thanks, Ina. And I think greetings to everybody. Celebrations are definitely in order. I mean, I can't believe it's 25 years. And it was really some event. And I'll speak to that in a minute. But just quickly, I think one of the takeaways for me was the run-up to Cairo, which you have referred to. I think that we really did well in organizing workshops across the land and doing something to bridge the gap between us and government, because as has been mentioned, those of us in the women's movement at the time, the workers' movement, there couldn't have been more of a yawning gap. And some of the friends will remember we had quite ding-dong battles with our government colleagues before Cairo. One of the things is that we have been able to subsequently use this strategy in many other struggles, health and non-health, this kind of strategy of having several small regional workshops and getting as many voices and views as possible. As for Cairo, 70 of us from India went. We were definitely a loud and noisy bunch. We were visible. The Indian contingent was definitely visible. For me, it was my first international UN conference. And really, I must say it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. I was extremely skeptical because I thought that UN conferences bring out rather bland documents and nothing much happens, but I was wrong to some extent. I also went with two of my Seva sisters, Chanda Ben, who was completely illiterate, old clothes vendor, whose comment when she was asked, what do you think of all of this? She said, if men had babies, we wouldn't be having all this heated discussion in the first place. And this was headlines. And of course, many people were not pleased with Chanda Ben's comment. And Rahima Ben was also with me and was really very disturbed to see and I will name the governments, to see, the government of Iran, the kind of stand that they took was quite shocking, not the kind of Islam that she knew about. The other thing I learned was that the fight was big. We fought with our government back home, but that was, as we say in Gujarati, chana mamra, nothing compared to the big fight we had at Cairo, which was with extremely powerful governments like the US government. And we saw that they unleashed all their firepower. The other thing I learned was that several civil society organizations in other countries also were very organized. They had their facts. They had all the data to counter the kind of propaganda that we were seeing. And the last thing was that, curiously, which we didn't expect, Indian civil society and the Indian government closed ranks. So we fought together, shoulder to shoulder, which I would never have thought we would be in a position to do from where we were earlier. And we had daily briefing meetings because all of us were not allowed into the government delegations. So our government delegation would brief Indian civil society, and we worked out sort of very kind of, I would say, supportive strategies. So they would say this needs to get done, and we would get information, and we worked well together. So it was a good way of working together, organizing together, and really we celebrated, even though the document had a lot of things, missed a lot of things that many of us would like to have had. For example, from a workers' organization perspective, no mention of work, occupational health, and how that interacts with women's reproductive and sexual rights and so on. But anyway, I'll stop here, but it was really an exhilarating experience, and it was a lot of fun. Not the least of which was wandering in the souks of Cairo, and every time people would shout at us Indians, Amitabh Bachchan, Amitabh Bachchan, and we would shout, Omar Sharif, much better.
Thank you. It really was an inspiring conference. Before I go on to other colleagues who are at Cairo, may I take a moment to ask Francine if she would like to say something since you have to step aside. Francine Pickup, acting UNFPA representative. I'm also heading UNDP.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've just come into what sounded like a fascinating discussion during this panel. I actually just wanted to quickly pick up on what you were saying, your last point. I think you called it the canary, which is the link between women's labor force participation and their reproductive choices and rights. And as UNDP, this is very much the angle at which we would approach this issue. And I just quickly wanted to say, as was mentioned, we do see this worrying paradox in India. India is not the only country, but the paradox is most stark here, where on the one hand, women's education has improved, and that will improve women's reproductive choice. But what we're also seeing is that women's education increases and improvement is not translating into women's participation in the labor force. And as you said, there has been a very sharp drop from 35 to 27%, I think, in the last few years in terms of women's labor force participation. And where we would come from this issue is that if you are able to increase women's economic empowerment, women's access to jobs, women's skills, women's entrepreneurship, it is one of the best ways of increasing their reproductive choice. It increases women's decision-making power in the home. By getting more money, women get more decision-making power in the home. and in the community, and they get more self-confidence and so on. So this is perhaps one of the most important things to do to increase women's reproductive choices by looking at how they can be economically empowered. And for that, we also need to look at ways to provide a more conducive work environment for women, and address their reproductive responsibilities, because we know that for every child that a woman has, her labor force participation, drops considerably. So, so I want to give some very concrete examples of how we try to address that. So one, for example, is, we're working in Haryana with Motor Corp to provide women with two-wheelers, right? And so by supporting women's mobility, you're actually helping them be able to get to jobs and look after their family's needs and their family's health needs as well. Another example, we work with businesses to help them develop a more conducive environment for women to work. So very simple things like introducing flexi time, or making sure there are restrooms for women, making sure there are creches or childcare facilities for women near the workplace. And a third example I want to give is women in the informal economy. We've got a large program with women waste pickers, where not only are we helping to formalize the value chain of waste management, but we're also looking at how we can support these women in the informal sector, very vulnerable women in the informal sector, to access social protection, health insurance for themselves and their families. So in sum, two things. One, let's, as was said in this panel, let's do what we can to look at those links between economic empowerment and reproductive choice. And two, look for ways in which the reproductive work of women is also addressed not just by women, but by husbands and families and workplaces.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're going to be going to a meeting on labor force participation for women. So I think wonderful that we had this discussion just before. So Kasama, you were at Cairo too?
Actually, I wasn't at Cairo, but I was very active before Cairo.
Yeah, feels like
and all the prep-com, everything. And as I can now, this morning I've been, mind is going back and thinking of all those days. And one of the things I can say is personal. It was very personal. I think for most of us, it was very personal because of our experiences, our work, where we've been observing inequities and all. And for me, it came from my work with women during my research, and also with women health workers. And two things came out of Cairo, pre-Cairo, post-Cairo for me. Two daughters, I will say. One daughter is my organization, Answers, which started just before Cairo, 1993, end of 93, where all my anxiety, agony for women and women health workers, it all became as an organization where I could work for women and women health workers. One of the reasons is when I was doing my research and gave these psychology, I think some of you would know, TAT tests to women and women health workers, almost from every story would come out a family planning thing. Like either if there's a man and a woman, one looking out of the window and one just standing, they would say, he's looking out of the window because he is wondering why she's going to have another girl now. The stories would all revolve around family planning, gender, sex, son preference. Somehow these would be a thing. And I started wondering a lot about it. That's how my organization grew up, about quality of care and equity. And immediately after Cairo, so many meetings. I think all of us were so engaged at that time. My daughter came, my physical daughter, not an organization. And just immediately after Cairo. And that was also another thing, to talk, to think, and to say things in meetings and all is different from when it comes to actually doing, actually implementing your values in real life. So, and then I started reflecting how difficult things are. If you want to have girl-child empowerment or protection or gender equity, it's not an easy thing. And I see that even today, 25 years later, we haven't really moved much. And of course, you have already said it. I don't think we have moved much in that direction of self-autonomy in decisions. I don't think there's much movement in that. But there are one or two things only that I would like to say. Immediately after Cairo, there was so much of euphoria, especially with Government of India and NGOs and civil society. And those days, I think the euphoria was the success at Cairo, and then the very positive engagement between civil society and the government, which resulted in RCH1. And Mr. Nanda, you will remember, RCH1 was very, very different from, even with all the toning down and the words and all, but still it was very different from what we had earlier. There was quality of care, there was gender, there was equal, at least the words were there. And a little of it was translated into action. But over time, what I see, two things which haven't happened is that NGO engagement, that civil society strength, and very positive way of giving inputs to governments regularly, of monitoring, of saying things in a very healthy, non-threatening atmosphere, I think has been lost. And that is one thing, since you asked Geeta about how to go about, in case, and UNFPA was very, very strong at that, in NGO engagement. If that can be brought in so that there can be a continuous dialogue of getting the women's voices, the inequities to the table and discussing in a positive way, that would be good.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop you here, Prakasama.
Yeah, that's it. That was my point.
Thank you. May I also welcome Dr. Sikdar, who's joined us, Commissioner of Family Planning from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. I'll come to you. Usha, would you like to say something? Usha Rai, senior journalist.
I'm Usha Rai. I'm a journalist, and I was at Cairo as a journalist representing the Indian Express. I won't speak very long, but I'll just say that I think because of the Cairo conference, there was a lot of attention in the media on population and health issues, and it was supported by the government and by UNFPA, and it continued for some time. But I see now that the media attention on these issues is almost down to zero. Very little appears. There's no space, and whatever little appears is so scattered that people are not really able to see what are the changes that are happening in the country. And that's where I think both the government and UNFPA need to keep that momentum of keeping the media engaged on these issues. I'll stop there.
Indu, you had your hand up. Indu Kapoor, who used to head Chetna, done still.
So I totally agree with both of them, and I'm not going to speak much, but the most exciting thing about Cairo is the pre-conferences, which Mirai has said, and Chetna was privileged enough to lead the ones in Gujarat and Rajasthan. And I must say we learned a lot. And the second most exciting thing was the collaboration between academia, government, and civil society. I thought they were very inaccessible actually before that, because many academic papers I didn't understand, and I found government to be a little, but during that conference, I think we made a genuine effort to listen to each other. And after that, I've been, this collaborative person, and I think it helped me and Chetna to really have that kind of dialogue, continuous. Till today, we continue to have dialogue and take the voices. Actually, I wanted to answer the ladies, it's an excellent effort. But I think till we make cities safe, cities and rural areas safe for women, I don't think the work participation is going to increase. And the second point is families need to be involved. Just empowering women is not going to work unless we address the family as a unit, so that, and including men. I totally agree with Vimla. We are ignoring men and boys, and we need to put that. Thank you, UNFPA, both for facilitating 25 years back and bringing us here. I'm so happy to see everyone, and I'm missing Mr. Sugatan.
Oh,
here.
right.
I'm so happy to meet all others, but I was really, I think he was also one of the key players in bringing the NGO and civil society together.
Mr. Sugathan was the Joint Secretary in the Health Ministry at the time of Cairo, and he was the major negotiator on behalf of India in the main committee. And a lot of the language that is reflected in Cairo came as a result of India's interventions and Mr. Sugathan's personal intervention.
Also, Geeta Sen. I mean, the way I learned from her, I mean, she was superb. I mean, she is still superb, I'm not saying. But I think this is the kind of person we need, particularly academician, who speaks understandable language, who knows the field and talks in a normal way. Usually people throw figures and other things. But Geeta Sen understood and she could put very well. And I'm missing Nasreen Haq, who was from Bangladesh. And amazing. So these are the two people who inspired me a lot during that. And Nasreen was a very close friend of mine after that. So I'm missing both of them. I mean, Sugathan and Nasreen.
We had
thank you.
Incredible. Thank you. We had some incredible women and some incredible men there at that time. Absolutely incredible. And that's why you'll see when the report is released, Geeta's in it. Just giving you a bit of a teaser. Poonam, you wanted to say something briefly?
So, for me, Cairo was a huge learning because I just set up the office for the MacArthur Foundation's population program in India. And the learning really began with the pre-preparatory process that UNFPA and many NGOs got involved and other donors led. And I think you need to do a case study on that, Ina, because that preparatory process continues to bring, well, it started a very contentious group to come together, which is between the feminists, women's health, women's groups, and I would say there was less tension with government, there was more tension and disagreements between the group. So bringing them through this very well-organized preparatory process and then going to Cairo, and absolutely, I did a lot of learning, not just from the process, but I used to hang out behind Geeta Sen, and you can imagine how much I learned in Cairo from her, and I discovered that there was this very well-organized international movement of women who were very prepared. A meeting or anything is as good as you prepare for it. And then the relationship with the government. I have not seen such a high point in not just we were working with our government, but I remember through Nasreen, we used to work with the Bangladeshi delegation, and that was one of, again, Geeta's trump card that she pulls out when you need it. So one learns a lot about advocacy. So if I'm doing today effective advocacy and giving anybody a hard time, you can partly blame ICPD and partly Geeta. Second, I'd like to say that in coming back from Cairo, we had, again, we didn't have only Mr. Sugathan, but we had Mr. Shunglu, who was the Secretary Health, who I'm remembering, who didn't come, but was very, very supportive, moving the agenda. And then, of course, Mr. Nanda came, and we had the target free, and not to forget health watch. So it didn't end in Cairo, the euphoria, the collective action, and many of you sitting, all of you sitting there were very much part of it. And I had the privilege of supporting along with UNFPA Health Watch. And Mr. Nanda and his colleagues in the Health Ministry really responded to a total paradigm shift in the 2002 policy. But I have to sadly say, and Mr. Nanda knows that because he struggled with it later with the government, outside the government, the paradigm shift of the target-free approach and women's rights and all those issues remain more in Nirman Bhavan. So we have to learn how, even today, Nirman Bhavan is a very rights-based, pro-women, pro-choice, almost a Cairo agenda, but how does it go down to the field? And Dr. Sigdar, who I call the czar of family planning and population, is sitting here. I'm sure he'll tell us how we reach. But right now, I'd like to say just three things that we need to, that we need to focus on, and we submitted in Cairo. India signed on the draft, no, on the program Cairo platform. And one unfinished agenda totally, which I want to add to what you were saying, is the incentives. Those worry me, and I have a debate going with Dr. Seegar all the time on that. And the day he agrees incentives don't work, I will retire. Second, I want to say that disincentive is something we have to worry about, not because Nirman Bhavan or anybody else is talking about it, but there is a huge movement, tax up, the two-child norm, all of these which are happening at the state level, not at the center level, we have to worry about. So post-Cairo, we may have something regressive happening. And finally, changing what we didn't invest in is, we talked about rights, the paradigm shift that happens when you change regressive norms that Geeta, Mr. Nanda, and Vimla referred to. So we have to focus a lot on changing social norms and behavior.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Poonam. In fact, all the process that happened before Cairo, which brought together the stakeholders and constituencies, was very ably led by Vimla. So credit goes to her. There's a lot of people I know who would like to say things, but we're running out of time. So I would like to just ask Bilali if you have any comments from UNH side. Briefly.
I think everybody has said the right things, and but what we'll say is just two things. As our big brother has said, I am a product of a woman, meaning simply that when I was growing up, my uncle and my father was fighting if I have to go to Quran school or if I have to go to the normal school. And my mother said, instead of fighting, why we don't send him to the two schools? Mm. And I have done the two schools. Okay. And since then, I have doubted about the myth that men were more intelligent than women. Number one. Number two, one thing which has saddened me today, I wake up and the first article which I have read on my WhatsApp was about how many women do not have wombs in Mumbai.
Indeed.
That was really shocking. And that means really UNFPA, UNICEF, UNDP, we have a lot to do with the government to really make sure that the rights of women are really respected. This is not good. India has to do more. India is better. And we really have to work together to make this a better place for women. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinali. Before we close the session, may I ask Yasmin to say a few words as the resident coordinator of the UN system in India? And
I'd rather speak as just Yasmin, who I think we're quite branded, those of us who were around the time of the ICPD, and I share in all the sentiments of excitement. I was on the fringes of it, but Nasreen Haq is a very good friend of mine. And I think what it did is building those bridges where we had the women's activist groups come together with also the OBGYN professionals, because they had to play an important role. We needed them on board. To bring them on board along with the academics, with government counterparts at different levels, especially the planning commissions. So I think it's not just the Ministry of Health, but the planning commissions and how they needed to be involved in it. But it also then opened the confidence, a seat of confidence that in Bangladesh we saw Nasreen Haq and Nari Pakho and other women's activist groups actually participating in all discussions. They got credibility as a stakeholder whenever we were designing health and family planning programs. So I think that's something which was really important. And I hope that somehow we find, I agree with the call to, let's get this stakeholder consultations going, but also let's find a seat at the fora that make decisions. Because till that is happening, a lot of the credible voice is still not coming together. I think as the UN, we still have a lot to do to make sure that the momentum continues to looking at the unfinished business moving forward. And definitely the paradigm in education and what are our children learning and what socialization is taking place. That's something that hasn't taken root. So that mindset element, which starts with the socialization, I think if there's one thing that I draw from my experience of working quite closely with community groups in MCH-based family planning programs, as we used to call them in those times, was how empowering family planning is, in the sense that when a woman understands that she can control her fertility, that's probably one of the most empowering elements, more than cash, more than many other elements. When a woman can see she doesn't have to be trapped in a pregnancy, she doesn't have to be trapped in her own body, which someone explained to me, which I had never considered how it can be for many women around the world. But that a lot of that empowerment is driven by the fact that they can control how their own body functions. And that's something that's still relevant even today in many ways. And I think the focus on family planning has to continue. It's not, and it not get lost in the broader array, because that's where choice is coming in. That's where agency is coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yasmin. It's been very refreshing listening to everybody, and it's actually brought back, for me personally, my whole professional career. I joined UNFPA soon before Cairo started, not very long before Cairo started. In fact, in the State of the World Population Report, we featured stories of women who were 10 years old in 1969 when UNFPA was founded. And we featured stories of women who were 10 years old at the time that Cairo took place. And I was doing some mental calculation, and I must admit that I was 10 years old when UNFPA was founded. And my professional work at UNFPA is captured, in fact, in the first chapter of the report, where it tells the story of the last 25 years. So many of the comments that were made here earlier is about how change comes about when it's personal. In a sense, it's a personal commitment, it's a personal vision, and then the whole is encompassed within that, because there is a harmony between what is that personal and what is the collective. And in fact, that is the story of Cairo. The report speaks of it as pitching a very big tent. And under that very big tent, we were able to bring together the myriad perspectives of civil society, the conflicting perspectives of civil society and government, the conflicting perspectives between governments, the perspectives of academia, and the perspectives of individuals who were at that time on the periphery, like the LGBT community. And issues which were on the periphery, such as sex, had to come from the boundary back into the center. And then they get pushed out, but they'll have to come back again. There's a very large unfinished agenda, as we have heard around the room and from the panel. Some of it, many people are already working on. Some of it is really virulent, and it's a good wake-up call to us to begin to address those issues very, very urgently, violence being one of them, and all the factors that underlie being others, like what happens when those young boys are looking at cell phones as pornography, but we're leaving young boys out of that whole discussion, that whole thing about socialization. What goes on in the individual's mind is eventually what goes on in the nation. So a lot for us to do together, a lot for us to do individually. And I hope 25 years from now, we still have something wonderful to celebrate, even greater than what we are celebrating today. Thank you. And over to Lashley, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you to the panel, a very distinguished panel, but also the voices from the floor, which took us back to Cairo, but also to the spaces in between. And on that note, and without any further delay,
May I please welcome on stage Dr. Sikdar from the Government of India, Mr. Klaus Beck from UNFPA, to formally release the State of the World Population Report 2019, Unfinished Business, the Pursuit of Rights and Choices for All. Letitia, please. Copies are also being kept at your table, plus all of you have pen drives with the report in your folders already provided to you. We tried to go green